For the first few years of the war in the Pacific, the Japanese Imperial Navy and Army Air Service operated under a blanket of geographical security that felt absolute. The Pacific Ocean was not just a body of water, it was a fortress of distance. To strike at the heart of the empire, Tokyo, Osaka, Kobe, an enemy had to cross thousands of miles of hostile water. The Japanese High Command knew the ranges of Allied aircraft down to the mile. They knew that heavy bombers like the B-17 or B-24 could technically reach certain targets if they stripped down to bare metal, but they also knew those bombers would be unescorted. A bomber without fighter protection was just a slow, fat target for the nimble Zero. They believed that the laws of physics and fuel consumption were their greatest allies. No single-engine fighter plane could carry enough fuel to fly from American bases, fight a life-or-death battle over the most heavily defended airspace in the world, and return home. It was a mathematical impossibility. Or so they thought. The shattering of that illusion began not with a roar, but with a silhouette. It is hard to overstate the shock that rippled through the Japanese aviation circles in late 1944 and early 1945. Picture a veteran Japanese pilot, perhaps a survivor of the brutal Solomons campaign, now stationed back on the home islands. He's flying a perimeter patrol near the coast, miles above the ocean. He feels safe. He knows that American carriers are hundreds of miles away, and he knows that land-based fighters are simply out of range. Then he sees a glint of silver in the high-altitude sun. At first, he might mistake it. Maybe it's a stray carrier plane, a Hellcat or a Corsair pushing its luck. But as the shape draws closer, the recognition brings a cold knot to his stomach. It has a laminar flow wing, square-tipped and sharp. It has a distinct belly scoop. It is the North American P-51 Mustang, and it is not alone. It is part of a swarm buzzing around the massive B-29 superfortresses like angry hornets. The Japanese pilot looks at his fuel gauge, then looks at the endless ocean stretching south, and his mind struggles to reconcile what his eyes are seeing. There are no aircraft carriers below them. These American fighters have flown from islands so far away that the round trip is a death sentence for any normal machine. The arrival of the P-51 Mustang over the Japanese home islands was not just a tactical defeat, it was a psychological catastrophe for the empire. To understand why, you have to understand the sheer terrifying logistics of the Very Long Range Missions, or VLRs. For an American pilot sitting in the cockpit of a P-51D on Iwo Jima, the mission briefing was enough to induce nausea. The target was Tokyo. The distance was roughly 650 miles each way, over open, featureless ocean. In a single-engine fighter, the ocean is a graveyard. If your engine coughs, if your oil line bursts, if you catch a stray bullet in the radiator, you are going into the drink. And in the vastness of the Pacific, rescue was a gamble at best. These pilots were being asked to strap themselves into a cramped cockpit for 7, sometimes 8 hours. They had to navigate through unpredictable weather fronts that could snap a small plane in half, fight a life-or-death battle over the most heavily defended airspace in the world, and find a tiny speck of volcanic rock in the middle of the ocean to land on before their fuel tanks ran dry. It was a mission profile that should have been impossible, but the Mustang was a freak of engineering nature. It was the marriage of American airframe design and the British Rolls-Royce Merlin engine built by Packard. It was fast, efficient, and lethal. But its secret weapon wasn't its guns, it was its plumbing. The P-51 had an internal fuselage tank behind the pilot seat that made the plane unstable until it was empty, but it gave them the legs to get halfway there. But the real game changers were the external drop tanks, these 110-gallon metal or paper teardrops hung under the wings, filled with high-octane aviation fuel. They were the lifeline. The pilots would take off heavy and sluggish, climbing slowly over the ocean, sipping fuel from these external tanks to save their internal supply for the fight. When the Japanese interceptors rose to meet the B-29s, they expected to find the bombers alone. They had developed tactics specifically for unescorted bombers, head-on attacks, slashing dives, targeting the engines and the cockpits. They would climb high, waiting for the heavy bombers to lumber into their sights. But suddenly the script flipped. as the Japanese fighters, often flying the K-84 Hayate or the N-1K George, formidable planes in their own right, climbed to intercept, they saw the little friends. The Mustangs would spot the rising interceptors, flip a switch to release their external drop tanks, and transformed instantly. One moment they were heavy, long-range haulers. The next, the tanks tumbled away, and they became one of the highest-performance dogfighters of the war. The shock for the Japanese pilots was absolute. They were caught in a trap of their own assumptions. They were climbing at full power, engines straining to reach the bomber's altitude, their maneuverability limited by the climb. The Mustangs, already at altitude and cruising, would dive on them. A Mustang in a dive was a terrifying thing. It was heavier than the Japanese planes, picking up speed like a falling anvil, yet retaining control thanks to its advanced wing design. They would scream down on the Japanese climbing fighters, 6.50 caliber machine guns tearing through the lightweight airframes of the Zeros and Oscars before the Japanese pilots even knew they were under attack. Saburo Sakai famously recounted the sinking feeling of seeing American fighters over Japanese soil. It signaled the end of the refuge. There was no rear area anymore. There was no safe zone. The combat that ensued over Tokyo and the Kanto Plain was ferocious. The Japanese pilots were fighting for their homes, often visible below their wings. They fought with desperation. But the Mustang pilots held all the cards. They had speed, they had altitude, and thanks to the G-suits that many American pilots were beginning to wear, they could pull tighter turns without blacking out, edging out the maneuverability advantage that the Japanese had relied on for years. But the Mustang's reign of terror wasn't limited to the air. Once the bombers had dropped their payloads and turned for home, the Mustangs often had a little ammunition and fuel left. They didn't just go home, they went hunting on the deck. This was perhaps the most demoralizing aspect for the Japanese military and civilians alike. The P-51s would drop from 25,000 feet down to treetop level. They prowled the countryside like sharks. They targeted airfields, shooting up parked aircraft that were being saved for the final defense against invasion. They strafed locomotives, tearing apart the already crumbling Japanese logistics network. They shot up staff cars, power stations, and radio towers. Imagine being a Japanese mechanic at an airfield north of Tokyo. You hear the high-altitude drone of the B-29s fading away. You think the raid is over. You come out of the bunker to inspect the runway. Suddenly, without warning, a silver blur screams over the tree line at 400 miles per hour. The sound of the Packard Merlin engine is a distinct, high-pitched growl. Before you can even dive for cover, the ground erupts in dirt and shrapnel as 6 machine guns walk a line of fire across the parked planes. In seconds, the Mustang is gone, pulling up into the blue, leaving burning wreckage in its wake. This was the reality the Mustang imposed. It paralyzed movement on the ground. The sheer numbers were overwhelming. In the final months of the war, hundreds of Mustangs were launching from Iwo Jima, the Sunsetters, the VLR groups. The navigation was handled by specialized B-29s acting as motherships, guiding the flocks of single-engine fighters through the weather fronts. It was an industrial-scale operation. There is a specific kind of helplessness that sets in when an enemy can operate with impunity over your capital city. For the Japanese high command, the presence of the Mustang was the final proof that their strategy of attrition had failed. They had hoped to make the Americans pay such a high price in blood for every mile that they would sue for peace. They had hoped that the vast distance of the Pacific would force the Americans to fight on Japanese terms. The Mustang broke that equation. It shrank the Pacific. It turned the 650 miles of water between Iwo Jima and Tokyo from a barrier into a highway. The Japanese pilots who went up to meet them were often young, inexperienced, and flying planes that suffered from poor quality control due to the bombing of factories and shortages of materials. They were facing American pilots who were rotated home after a certain number of missions, meaning the U.S. retained its experience while Japan lost its veterans. when a green Japanese pilot in a Fragile Zero looked up and saw a formation of P-51s gleaming in the sun, escorting the bombers that were about to burn his city to the ground, he wasn't just seeing an enemy plane, he was seeing the industrial might of a nation that could build a fighter plane with the range of a bomber and the agility of a sport plane. The psychological impact extended to the B-29 crews as well. For months, they had flown the lonely gauntlet, scanning the skies for the inevitable interceptors, watching their wingmen spiral down in flames. The arrival of the little friends changed the morale of the entire bomber force. Seeing the silver-tailed Mustangs weaving S-turns above them gave the bomber crews the confidence to focus on their bomb runs rather than looking over their shoulders. It allowed the destruction of the Japanese war industry to proceed with terrifying efficiency. In the end, the Mustang didn't win the war alone. It was part of a massive, complex system of war-making, but it was the symbol of the collapse of the Japanese perimeter. It destroyed the one thing the Japanese military had counted on since the attack on Pearl Harbor: distance. When the war ended and American occupation forces landed, they found airfields littered with the wreckage of Japanese aircraft that had never even taken off, destroyed on the ground by prowling Mustangs. They found a Japanese air force that had been grounded not just by a lack of fuel, but by the sheer impossibility of fighting an enemy who could be everywhere at once. The Japanese pilots couldn't believe the range of the P-51 because it defied the logic of 1940s aviation. It was a weapon that erased geography, and in a war fought across the largest ocean on Earth, the ability to erase geography was the ultimate victory. The Silver Ghost over Tokyo proved that there was nowhere left to hide.